1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We're ready to go? Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day to those of you who have fought and bled for our country. On behalf of my family, thank you. This is going to be a little bit more of a special discussion. There's no funny witticisms or skits. This is just going to be a more frank discussion on the foundation of what the 4th of July is, what it means to me, and hopefully what it means to some of you, and the Second Amendment and what I believe is important to take away from the Second Amendment as it applies to the 4th of July. And also, because this is a gun channel and we are dedicated to the guns here, the AR-15 and how it plays into a discussion of the Second Amendment and Independence Day. So let's jump right into it. The Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So let's parse that text real quick. When the Founding Fathers penned that, they're coming off the Revolutionary War that we had just fought for a decade. And before that, the French and Indian War, that really defined a lot of our military tactics going into the Revolutionary War. So they were well-versed in combat and the tactics of the day. They had just fought and essentially won a guerrilla war against the world's superpower. The British military was second to none. They had the world's largest navy and the world's most effectively equipped and well-trained fighting force on land. The Redcoats were no joke. And there's something to be said for a group of young men who will stand on a hilltop, shoulder to shoulder, 3 to 4 rows deep, however many at the time of the engagement, and stand less than 100 yards away from what is almost certain death and exchange gunshots with such precision that they were accurate out to 100 to 150 yards with a smooth bore musket and were capable of reloading, I believe it was 2 to 3 times in a couple minutes. If you know anything about flintlock rifles, that is an incredible feat of military training, considering that you're receiving orders, you are being shot at, and there are people dying to the left and right of you. It's much different than how we would traditionally think about warfare from our modern 21st century context, but I digress the point, just my tism coming through on history. So a militia, does it mean a military fighting force, or does it mean just your run-of-the-mill, Chuck and Larry sitting in their fields, preparing to harvest when they get the call to arms? Well, according to the Founding Fathers, it was maybe a bit of both, because they saw them as one and the same thing. At the time of the Revolutionary War, as it started, there was no standing United States Army. The institution of the Army did not exist yet. There were militias, and there were many of them. And they were expected to answer the call should the Continental Congress convene and declare it necessary for them to do so. But other than that, there was no, as I said, institution, or I guess you could say organization of the United States military. It was your average guys who owned implements of war, which at the time would have been a powder horn, your patchmaking supplies, your musket itself, spare flints, and lead to make your shot with, as well as tools to make your shot, and then your knife, and in some cases a uniform. And they were also required to have a working knowledge of the military doctrine of the British Redcoats, or just the British military. And that's a pretty significant point that I'd like to elaborate on for just a second. So again, going back to this idea of what is the militia, and is it something that when you hear, CNN mention that it's, they're specifically mentioning a military institution, it's not your average citizen, and therefore the Second Amendment, as it applies to people, is more along the lines of like your recreational firearms, but weapons of war, your assault weapons, are meant only to be for the military in times of great need. And I would just argue that that is just a complete and utter falsehood based on a more conservative reading of the text and also a little bit of history on how these events unfolded and what they were actually all about. But to bring it back for just a second, I was talking about the necessary need for the average man who was in a militia to have a working knowledge of the British Empire's tactics. As I stated before, the Redcoats were a force to be reckoned with. They were no joke. They would end up fighting us again in 1812, and then later on they would face off against Napoleon and many other instances where the Redcoats would just show their ability at incredible discipline and very effective fighting tactics that they used to great effect. Just can't belabor that point enough, that it really wasn't like we were fighting a bunch of politicians' sons who knew nothing about war and were scared of dying. That's just simply not the case. Again, for the third time now, as I try to bring it home on this one point. I apologize, I am getting somewhere. The knowledge of the British military manual of arms, so to speak, is important to note, because what it denotes is that your average man would need to be versed on the most effective tactics, the most effective means of killing, and he would need to have some practice, drill or whatever it looked like for them to be somewhat disciplined in the art of war. As I mentioned previously, what was the average man required to have? A musket, which at the time there were really, you had two main, I guess you could call them alternatives, but you had a lot of homegrown gunsmithing going on in the United States at the time, before it was the United States in the 13 colonies. But the Kentucky long rifle really kind of shone through as being the American hunting rifle. It was incredibly long, and it was lethally accurate out to 200 yards. Whereas the British Brown Bess was a tried and true platform, but it was shorter, and it had an effective range of around 100 to 150 yards, depending on what texts you read. And again, this is based on just some historical reading that I've done on the subject before bringing this all to you guys. But that matters, because we're talking about like what the most effective means of dealing death on the battlefield was available to the civilians as well as the military. In this case, it was actually the edge was with the civilians, much like it is today. If you know anything about how the military is equipped, typically civilians have access to the latest and greatest and cutting edge technology, optics and that sort of thing. The average rank and file soldier simply gets what he's issued. And so there's always been a disparity there. But I want to home in on that one point, that the average man owned, was trained with, and had knowledge of the most effective military doctrine with the most effective military tool at that time. Cutting edge. So let's continue to flesh that out a little bit more. Well, we have letters from the architects of the Constitution, specifically James Madison, who wrote in one of his letters of marque and reprisal to a captain of a privateer vessel, which, if you know anything about maritime warfare in the 18th century at this point, closing on almost to the 19th, privateers were a big deal. Typically what it would be were private citizens who owned with their own finances the means and the production of war. Usually they were merchant vessels that had been converted, but they could have been just ships that were intended for warfare. I'm not a maritime scholar. That's just my peripheral understanding of it. But in his letter, James Madison mentions that not only is it legal and lawful for the captain to own these cannons, but that he was free to use them, again, for letters of marque against reprisals to the English in the War of 1812. And so the government basically licensed this private citizen to act on behalf of the United States in congruence with the Navy to fight back against the British aggression in 1812. So I guess you could say the argument to that would be like, but it was a time of war. But not so fast. This was a private citizen who owned what would be essentially the equivalent today of like a battleship with, you know, the largest and most effective means of destruction available to those vessels. It was a privately owned entity, and they had the means of destruction that were equal to, if not greater than, the British that they were fighting. So that's very important to know. So let's go ahead and move on and talk a little bit more about how does this relate to us today. So growing up my whole life, I had to listen to a lot of uneducated people mention how destructive and evil and awful the AR-15s were, and how they're essentially equivalent to what the military is using, and how a moral society has no need for death-dealing machines such as these. It's a bit hyperbolic, but again, we've all watched CNN and we've seen some of the brain-dead takes that some of your liberal talking points possess.
If I wanted to fire this on full semi-automatic, all I do is keep firing.
This right here has ability with a 30 caliber clip to disperse with 30 bullets within half a second.
They're meant to evoke emotion. They're meant to trigger people's heartstrings and get them to emote, essentially. They're not meant to do anything other than that. So let's talk about the AR-15 as the elephant in the room here. It is, by and large, the most commonly available rifle in America. I forget the numbers, but there are millions of them at this point. It is the most common caliber, it is ubiquitous, and it's available widespread everywhere. The AR-15, again, being an assault-style rifle, which would be the proper context in which to call it such, because it is meant to be used in that capacity. But it is not limited to. What do I mean by that? Well, it can serve a myriad of different purposes. You have your 10.5, Mark 18 style, CQB. You have your 300 blackout, very short 8.5 to 10-inch rifles, sometimes even shorter. You have your 18-inch DMRs, your 20-inch standard length M16s, because the Marines just have to be Chads like that. And then you have your standard 14.5 length carbine that the Army was issued for forever. So that they come in all shapes and sizes, but essentially they're all more or less serving in that role as the assault rifle of America. And I would argue, and I present to you the idea, that the AR-15 is the modern iteration of America's fighting rifle. And that's not necessarily a hot take. I think most of you watching this would agree with that. And there are lots of different calibers. This isn't a debate on whether or not 5.56 or 223 is the most effective caliber. Perhaps I'll talk about that at a later time. But for right now, it is the most commonly available caliber, and everyone has one, or most people do. What do I mean by bringing all that up? Well, again, tying it back to my earlier statements about the Second Amendment and that brief history on what the local militias meant, there's a concept that really came out of it, the American Minuteman. And the idea being that in a minute's notice, your average working man could take up his rifle and fight on behalf of his family to defend life, liberty, and property. Those are God-given rights that were recognized by the Founding Fathers. They are not issued by government. They are recognized by our governing body as a God-given right. Bears mentioning twice because it's true. How does the AR-15 really play into that? Well, you probably already guessed where I'm going with this, but as America's fighting rifle, I believe that in a modern day scenario, if there were such a need to arise again, and I do believe in the very near future that that is a very likely possibility, that the AR-15 will be the fighting rifle of the American public. And it is equal to, and it is on par with what the current military has. And that is a good thing. It is very clear from the text of the Declaration of Independence that the Founding Fathers found that it was necessary that for a free people to self-govern, that at some point armed revolution is necessary to protect the rights and the beliefs of the people from tyranny. And the only true power that a people has to oppose its government is with force. And the AR-15 is that force. That's why they're so scared of it. And that's why they try to demonize it. Again, I'm not sharing anything with you that most of you don't already know. And if you disagree with what I am saying, you're the very person that this is intended for. I am simply trying to relay both an educational, hopefully an educational video, but also present to you the reasons for perhaps the optics of the AR-15 need to be redefined. And I'm going to take it back because I'm sick and tired of it being maligned as simply just an instrument of death. I would actually argue it's an instrument of life. Because if, God forbid, there should ever come a day when we should have to take up arms again to defend life, liberty, and property, as I believe that we may be called upon to do, it is in protection of life, in protection of liberty, and ultimately so that future generations may not know war. And that is the true right of Americans, I believe, the Founding Fathers meant for us to have for generations, was that ability to stand up for ourselves and not rely upon the government to recognize tyranny within itself, that we would have the tools and the instruments to take matters into our own hands should that need arise. So, maybe bring it a little bit out of such a possibly dark context. I know Civil War is not necessarily a fun topic, but it bears mentioning as it's the context of the statement that I made. So, as the AR-15 relates, I believe that the 16-inch ubiquitous common AR-15 is the fighting rifle of the American Minuteman, or at least it should be. There's no tax stamp required. There's no NFA restrictions on it, which are even more polarizing now than ever with the total and complete lack at the time of making this video. Congress has just neutered the Safe Hearing Act and the Short Act because making your rifle 3 inches shorter, under 16 inches, makes it 6 times more lethal. And as such should be tracked, and you should be fingerprinted, and the sheriff should know you have it. And all of those other unconstitutional, illegal things that have been ruled on time and time again, yet the government refuses to protect our right in that manner. However, the 16-inch rifle, I think, actually has some benefits that a lot of people overlook because over the last 15 years, we saw the rise of short-barreled rifles really take precedence in Iraq because there was a lot of close-quarters combat that was being fought. And with the advent of the Mark 18, which is just a peak sexy rifle, with that Daniel Defense Riz Rail, you're not going to get any argument from me. It is absolutely just hot, with a capital H-O-T. But there are some limitations with a 10.3-inch barrel. You're really only pushing that static shock effect at about 100 yards. Past that, it's still lethal, but you have to worry about shot placement at that point. You can potentially ice pick your target. Again, this is not a ballistics video. This is not a discussion about which barrel length is the right length. I'm not an expert on that, but I will try to relay that information to you as best I can here. I think the 16-inch rifle really, at about 2,800 feet per second with your standard 55 grain soft FMJ rounds, are going to be what most Americans have either in reserve or they shoot with regularly, like myself and perhaps you. And that is going to be what most people will grab should the need arise. It's the best combination of range, accuracy, and the least amount of hoops to jump through for the most amount of people to get their hands on. And I mean, you can have an AR-15 for as little as $4 bills with the, thanks to Palmetto State Armory and other institutions that are just making great firearms for an amazing price. So I've kind of really let my tism shine talking about that for a while here. So again, the AR-15 is in my opinion, analogous to what our founding fathers had when they decided that armed revolution was necessary at the time. If you compare them as a one-to-one, they were using the most effective means at the time. So having that most effective means of killing available to you, and yes, it is for killing in defense of life, which I believe is both a Christian virtue and also the right of Americans that we need to protect. And the AR-15 is our modern day version of that tool, and we need to be protecting that and fighting for our right to have such. because no one's going to war with a 6-shot revolver and a 5-round hunting rifle. Now, I'm sure some of you could do work with those things, and you're probably much more talented with them than I. However, I would rather not carry a .410 Judge and a Remington, deer rifle. I'd rather be carrying, a couple hundred rounds of 5.56 and know that my buddy to the left and right of me have the same amount of ammunition on them, and we're all carrying more or less the same rifle for lots of different reasons. But try not to belabor the point too much, so let's move on. As one wise man once said, a armed society is a polite society. So speak softly and carry a big stick, as Teddy Roosevelt said. Now, that seems very American and machismo and on the nose, but I believe that it really sums up the heart of what the Second Amendment really stands for. To be a gardener in a war is a bad thing, and therefore you should be the most highly trained version of yourself possible. Now, I understand that not everyone has the ability to hit the range 2-3 times a week, maybe not even once, but try to find time when you can. Find a community of people around you that hold the same beliefs as you. This 4th of July, remember what the Declaration of Independence was signed for. It was signed for future generations of Americans, that we may not know tyranny, that we may not live under the boot of a government who does not understand our struggles, who does not share our beliefs, and does not walk in our shoes. And the Founding Fathers found that to be so vitally necessary that most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence would be dead not long after the signing of it. Most of them were hunted down and killed. And that's a somber thought, but they believed in what they were writing. So when you're drinking, hopefully not Bud Light, around your 4th of July celebration, you're setting your fireworks off with your friends and family, and you hold your children close, remember that men died, good men and women died, to give us those freedoms and those rights, and that we best honor their sacrifice by remembering, and by holding fast to the truths and convictions of what our country was founded on. And I'll try to sum it all up with a few closing thoughts here. Again, the Second Amendment is not for hunting. It's not for recreation. It's for making war upon those who would rob you of your rights and steal life for the sake of tyranny. And sometimes those come with the best of intentions. And we know that the road to hell is often paved with those. So when the government comes with their hand out, asking to steal just a little bit more of your freedom, you give an inch and they will take a mile. Again, at the time of making this video, it's very disheartening to see how the Senate, that has a majority, so ineffective at protecting that Second Amendment right, at limiting our ability to possess suppressors and short-barreled rifles, which they have deemed to be the most dangerous thing humanly possible, next to a nuclear warhead. And we know the reason why. They're not stupid. We know why. Because they know if they ever have to come at the point of a sword, if there is a sword pointed back at you, it usually causes the aggressor to think, do I really want this fight? And that is the true heart of what the Second Amendment means to me and my family. And hopefully now that I've maybe reiterated some, again, of the most common conservative talking points about the Second Amendment and the Revolutionary War and the nature around the Second Amendment and what was the intention of the Founding Fathers in writing that, maybe I've connected the dots a little bit more. And again, my final thought is thus, that to make war and to be effective, one must have the most effective means at his disposal. And I, again, am going to state very plainly that I believe the AR-15 is that tool. And we would be remiss if we did not fight to protect that right. And I live, thankfully, in a free state where that right is well enshrined in the belief system of the people around me, as well as the government, locally anyway. But you may not. And that is up to you what you choose to do if you know where your state stands. But I'll close now and say thank you so much for watching this video on the 4th of July. Hold your families close. Remember to instill in those around you a sense of patriotism and duty, because ultimately it's about service, it's about protecting others, and it's about serving each other. It's not about beer, it's not about barbecues, it's not about fireworks, even though those are good things, and together they represent the celebration of life and freedom. But just remember that it truly is about sacrifice, and that we have a duty to protect that sacrifice and make sure that future generations have an opportunity to do so for their future generations. So, if you've enjoyed this video, thank you so much for sticking around to the very end. I know I can be a little long-winded, and I know that sometimes it's easy to just skip to the end or drop off early. So thank you so much for watching the entire thing. Again, if you've served, thank you for your service. Like and subscribe helps the channel best. It is growing, and I am so blessed and thankful to each and every one of you who has left a comment, who has made fun of my mustache or made me laugh in the early hours of the morning as I nervously scroll through to see how many roasts I'm looking at first thing in the morning. I thank you to each and every one of you. And if you can share this video with somebody that you know that may need to know this information, if you think it is worth sharing, thank you. That honors me, and I hope that it allows you to be able to share this discourse a little bit more with them. So again, wrapping it all up, like, share, and subscribe. Those are the 3 best ways to support me and to help the Second Amendment and its supporters on YouTube. They're famous for hating on gun content, and the algorithm doesn't do us any favors. You can also find me on Rumble, the same username. Thank you guys so much. Happy 4th of July. God bless America, and God bless you.